Welcome to the New World of Work. I am Adi Ignatius, Editor-in-Chief of Harvard Business Review, and we are broadcasting today live from the World Economic Forum in Davos. So that means I have less makeup on, but I do have the official badge. My guest today is a really appropriate guest for a show from here, but before I introduce him, I want to read a letter from, we want to hear from our friends at Unisys. Where some see barriers, Unisys sees breakthroughs. Unisys pushes what's possible across digital workplace, app modernization, cloud, and beyond. Unisys, keep breaking through. One other thing, if you like the content like this, I urge you to check out our leading podcast, the IdeaCast. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. I also want to ask you if you have questions for our guest today, put them into the chat. I'll try to get to questions later. And now I will introduce our guest. So that is Ian Bremmer, a political science and the founder and president of Eurasia Group, who's a political risk research and consulting firm based in New York City. Ian is a prolific author, including in the pages of Harvard Business Review, and the weekly newsletter that he and his Eurasia Group colleagues put out every Monday is among the best read newsletters in the circles that I travel in. So Ian, welcome.
Hey, Adi, great to see you, man.
So it's great to have you here. And like I said, you're kind of the perfect guy to talk to on Davos week. And you know, these are your people. So why don't we start? Tell me, you've been here probably for a few days. What's your highlight of the first few days of the World Economic Forum?
Maybe two highlights in the sense that they've been very interesting to me. The first was kicking off on Monday. I spent an hour and a half with sort of a curtain raiser for the congressional delegation that the United States has brought over, Republicans and Democrats, a bunch of senators, a bunch of House reps. Was nice to see here just how much constructive relationship building is happening on key issues, on industrial policy, on trade, on immigration. I mean, the kind of things that you would never suspect from headlines in cable news or if you listen to your crazy uncle. And of course, there's some self-selection going on with the people that are bringing themselves to Davos. I mean, it's not the far right or the far left, but still, it's absolutely bipartisan. And that was, as an American and as someone who has lived through the last several years of enormously dysfunctional and partisan governance, it was nice to see. The second thing I would say was the vice chair from China, Liu He, his opening statement, and then some of the private comments he made afterwards. This is a guy who overwhelmingly is trying to send the message, sell the message that China is open for business again. And, you know, he didn't, 20-minute speech with Klaus on the main stage, did not mention COVID once. Doesn't exist anymore. Everyone's already gotten it. It's in the rearview mirror. No need to talk about that. You know, part of it is how much do you believe that he actually has power? And part of it is how much do you believe he's really telling the truth? And I'm not sure about either of those things, but it was a very, very different message than we've been hearing from Chinese officials over the course of the past several years.
Yeah, well, this is great, unless you're the crazy uncle, in which case we could discount all of that. So Ian, HBR's audience is primarily made up of business executives. And, you know, I know you guys do reports on the business risks around the world, but if you had to pick one thing, and obviously we have a global audience, but one thing that's in your sort of view as possibly the biggest business risk for 2023, what would that be?
Probably that rogue actors are becoming so much more powerful and disruptive. And when I mean rogue actors, Adi, what I'm talking about are a group of individuals that have almost complete control over the institutions they're in. They're surrounded by yes men. They don't get great information, especially about the second and third order effects of the decisions they take, and they have virtually no checks and balances. And so, of course, I'm talking first and foremost about Vladimir Putin, whose enormous misjudgment, the biggest misjudgment of any major leader on the global stage, really in decades, And so it's not just that he wanted to invade Ukraine and that no one could stop him. It's also that he had no idea how his army would perform. He had no idea how the West would respond. I mean, that's why this is such a massive disruptive risk, is because it's not just that he wanted to be crazy, but that he was capable of being so crazy. I worry that geopolitically, there are a number of actors like that on the global stage. We've known about Kim Jong-un for a long time, of course, the Iranian supreme leader, but also increasingly Xi Jinping, not because I think he's crazy, but because he's consolidated so much power around him. And therefore, it is no longer as possible to oppose a decision that he is aligned with. And of course, so it's as consolidated as it was under Mao. But in the Mao days, businesses didn't have that kind of exposure to China, and China didn't have that kind of impact in global markets. And since I'm talking about people with incredible control over their institutions and no checks and balances, I would also add to that Mark Zuckerberg, I'd add to that Elon Musk. They're not dictators in countries, but they do control, truly control, immensely powerful global platforms that operate with some level of sovereignty outside of the power purview, even of governments. And I think that the disruptive implications of that, for good and for bad, are also unprecedented.
So there's a lot I want to come back to in that, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, it sort of reminds me of when China invaded Vietnam to teach them a lesson several decades ago. They were able to realize really quickly that it was going badly, and they pulled out, relatively quickly. But it reminds me of that same kind of hubris, I guess, and miscalculation. But that leads me to a question: how good are any of us at forecasting what's coming down the road? I mean, people like to talk about, well, the World Economic Forum didn't foresee Russian invasion, didn't foresee this or that. A lot of the game-changing events we don't see. So talk about what you do. You're forecasting political risk, but then there are these sort of black swans, positive and negative. So how do you do what you do, and how do we really know what's coming down the pipe?
Yeah, well, I mean, the obvious answer is that we don't, and people get things wrong all the time. So it's important to come clean on that. I think there are two ways that you mitigate uncertainty if you're really trying to project where the world is going. The first is less about prediction and more about the realm of what's not possible. I think it's very important to understand, given the interests and resources that are available to given actors, what are the things that they say politically that they can't do. So, for example, that political leaders in the US can't move towards strong decoupling from the Chinese economy, even if that's what they're saying, because of where they get their money from. Because of the impact that would have on so many of their direct interests, because of what it means for the ambitions and for the business models of those that are really relevant stakeholders. So I think, applying the realm of the not possible constrains significantly the things that you think might happen. So many people talk about what might happen because it's what they want to happen. They conflate ideology with analysis, especially in today's very polarized environment. That always gets people into trouble. So that's the first thing I would say. But the second thing I would say is you need to have an environment around you that is culturally disposed to getting it right and being honest about when you get it wrong. So, I mean, a very simple thing that you think everyone would do. The most important analytic piece we put out every year is what we call our top risks report. We put it out on the first Monday of every new year. And then we leave it on and the entire firm analytically is involved in it. It's a long process, and it's very robust, and And then we put it on our homepage, and we leave it up the entire year on our homepage. And then in the last week of every year, we go back and publicly say, okay, let's look at these things again with a fresh eye. What have we gotten right? What have we gotten wrong? What lessons do we take from that? What do we learn? How do we apply those things? I don't understand why every organization that's involved in analysis doesn't do that publicly and privately. I don't understand why they don't. None of them do. None of them do it. I don't understand.
I love that transparency, and I think the answer is obvious. They don't want to be sort of exposed and want to. But I love that you do that.
I don't
So,
think it's that they don't want to be exposed. I think they're just not culturally oriented towards it. I think it's because the business model is usually not about content. The business model is actually about something else. And that's fair, right? Like, I mean, if I were a big bank and the reason I put out content is simply one way to differentiate, from other big banks, but what I'm really about is just trying to make sure that I'm getting a bigger share of wallet from all of these clients that are out there, then I don't really care about like how accurate the content is out, as long as it makes a big splash when it comes. Well, but if you're an organization like ours that literally our entire business model is content, then that's what you have to do.
All right, so if you just joined us, my guest is Ian Bremmer, who's the president of Eurasia Group and a political scientist and a political risk analyst. If you have questions for Ian, put them into the chat and we'll try to get to some of them later. So, you talked about that it would be very difficult for the U.S. to in fact decouple from China, even if the rhetoric is that way. But I just want to ask, I mean, that Russia's invasion and the response to it is worth unpacking a little bit, because most U.S. companies, a lot of Western companies, suddenly ended their businesses in Russia. It broke ties with partners who may have been, local partners in Russia may have been as anti-Putin as the American investors were. But the logic of sanctions is just it's such a blunt tool that there was no room for nuance. So suddenly these economic relationships were broken. I mean, that could happen, right? That could happen elsewhere. I mean, if you're thinking about political risk, if you're a business, don't you have to diversify the supply chain and think about the worst case scenario where this happens somewhere else?
Of course you do. But let's first of all, a couple points here that are really important to nuance what you just said. So, I mean, there is a very strong level of decoupling that is going on from Russia, but it's a lot less than the headlines. I mean, you've got organizations like BP that say they're decoupling from Russia, say they're selling, they haven't sold. And when you ask them why they haven't sold yet, it's like, well, because right now, if we were to sell those assets, we just go to the Russians. And do you really want us to do that? And, it just gives them the capacity to exploit them. Well, that may be true, and it may be a reasonable argument, but that's not decoupled, right? And there are a lot of organizations out there that are, like publicly decoupling and privately dragging their feet. That's still very true, and not many people are talking about it. Number two, everyone out there opposes Putin in the West. I mean, Tucker Carlson and Noam Chomsky are about the only well-known Americans you can find that are willing to actually sort of publicly take and say, well, maybe actually Putin has a point. Nobody else. And so as a consequence, it's very easy for corporations to make that call on Russia. On any other issue with significant assets at stake, you would find far more nuance, far more challenges in taking one side or the other. It'd be much more like Disney picking, California or Florida, and you're going to alienate the other half of your constituents no matter what you do. So what do? You talk out of both sides of your mouth. You don't actually, sort of implement on it. That's a lot more clear. But again, I want to get to ideology on this too, because so much of this is just overblown by headlines. I was just one of the opening panels at Davos. I think it was the opening panel at Davos. I was on the stage with someone I like a lot personally, Neil Ferguson. And I've known him for a long time, the great and sort of celebrated historian at Stanford, Harvard, lots of other places, written lots of books. But he's decided ideologically that he's going to be attached to the idea that there's going to be a Cold War between the US, China, and China. First he said there's going to be, and now he says we're in one. And we're not. And objectively, we're not. Objectively, President Biden continues to say that we're not, both publicly and privately to Xi Jinping. He's told everyone around him that we absolutely don't want to be in one. Xi Jinping has made the same statements. And yet, Neil Ferguson continues to say that. Now, in part because it's useful to be a bit of a bomb thrower and kind of a professional oppositionist, and in part because now that he's committed to it, he kind of wants it to happen. And I told him on stage, I said, it's kind of like fetch. No matter how many times you say it, you can't make it happen. And I think that it's the problem we have, especially when it comes to punditry and professional intellectuals, is there's not much excitement in being nuanced. There's not much excitement in having a headline that says, no, actually, that's overblown. No, actually, yes, we are doing a limited amount of decoupling in areas that are dual use on national security, semiconductors, 5G, but it's actually not impacting all of these sectors. And in fact, something really unsexy to say, the United States actually really needs a robust economic China, that the alternative would be a disaster for everyone. We all understand that. I mean, you're not going to get members of Congress to say that publicly, but they all say it privately. And so, yes, there's going to be more hedging, and I see it. I see Apple hedging more away from China because of what they've seen through COVID and now sort of post-COVID in China. But the hedging that Apple is doing is incremental, and it's not because of the US government. It's not because the Americans are heading into a Cold War or containment. It's just because they see that they're not getting paid for the level of risk that they're taking in China right now.
Okay, so part of the China conversation is trying to analyze what is happening, at the highest echelons of political leadership, what is happening with Xi Jinping. When the party Congress ended a couple months ago, it seemed like, wow, Xi Jinping has really consolidated power. He's removed the reformers. He's removed any kind of clique that isn't the Xi Jinping clique.
Yep.
And identified with policies like zero COVID, and identified with policies like a kind of relatively harsh rhetoric toward the West, toward the US. Okay, now it's flipped. I mean, now the COVID policy changed. There is this thaw. You talked about Liu He, speaking at World Economic Forum, saying we're open, foreign investors come on in. So, and I've seen, very informed analysts who think Xi Jinping has, that he must have lost some degree of power. Others who think that's ridiculous. He had no choice but to do this. I'm interested how you read. I know you can't know, but how do you read what's happening?
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, I don't see it. Like a lot of people say Putin's lost the level of power, given, his economy has contracted by 3.5%. It was growing strongly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO's expanding. Ukraine is stronger. On every front, you think that Putin is losing control. And yet inside Russia, you don't see it. You don't see significant demonstrations. There were some briefly after they called up the 300,000 in the special mobilization. That's it. You've seen, I guess, about 18 or 20 mid-level oligarchs commit suicide by jumping out of windows. And that makes it very clear that there are going to be consequences if you're even thought to be disloyal to the regime. But there's not a significant challenge that I see to Putin domestically. And I don't see it in China either. I see an enormous concentration of power. I see loyalists all the way from the top to the mid-levels of the Chinese Communist Party elite hierarchy and leadership aligned thoroughly and loyal thoroughly to Xi and those that he has groomed over the years. I think it's unprecedented. And I think the fact that he had no intention of pivoting away from zero COVID after the party Congress or after the G20 in Bali when he was meeting with Western leaders, and it was only after he saw demonstrations on the ground, relatively small demonstrations, that kind of shows you how much control he actually has, because he's able to make that decision, then he's able to change that decision. Now, the problem here, Adi, is that the one thing that we've known from China over the past decades is they're authoritarian, they're state capitalist, but they execute reasonably well and strategically. So when they decide to put a policy in place, they focus on how they're going to implement the policy. Well, here, you saw them suddenly decide that they're going to rip the Band-Aid off of zero COVID. They're not ready at all. They don't do a couple cities first, so they make sure the hospitals don't get overwhelmed or they can move people into other hospitals. No, it's free for all. We're just not going to test anymore. They approve for Pfizer to finally have a distributor after waiting for months and months, finally having a distributor for Paxlovid, the most important therapeutic that you have out there for COVID. They only do it after Xi Jinping has made his decision, so there's not enough in place. So people are selling it on the black market, $5,000 a dose in some place. Then the Chinese public gets annoyed about it, and they're saying, we don't want to take it. It's only for the elites. And then the Chinese government pivots again and says, well, okay, we'll support Chinese therapeutics that aren't as good and Eastern medicine that doesn't work. My God, we're all delighted that China is moving away from zero COVID. We're going to have much higher growth from China in the second, third, fourth quarters this year. It'll be supply chain is going to be moving fast again. People aren't going to be stuck in their homes. All that is to the good. But my God, they've executed so poorly on this pivot. And this is precisely the thing that business leaders over the past years, whether they liked doing business in China or they were definitely scared of it, they knew they could count on reasonably competent execution.
So, and that's, by the way, I think Eurasia Group called it right in terms of what would happen in China. So one thing that I picked up here in Davos is a lot of countries, and particularly European countries, who are feeling that the U.S. is kind of pushing them too much to align with U.S. sanctions policies, particularly toward Russia, but sometimes toward China. Penalizing companies, penalizing areas of trade. With Russia not buying Russian oil and gas, and a common theme that Europeans, yes, they're against what's happened in Ukraine. They want to support to a degree, but they also want a certain amount of flexibility in their ability to, whatever it is, provide energy supplies to their people, or just have some sort of relationship with these countries that even as the U.S. is on a kind of heightened, not war footing, but heightened level of tension. I think it would, I feel like the U.S. would benefit from understanding that and being more nuanced, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm so glad we're doing long form because we can have a real conversation about this. So the reality is that the Europeans themselves have been fairly divided about how much they actually want to push. Remember, the Americans are not preventing the Europeans from buying oil from Russia right now. The Americans pushed hard. Secretary Yellen pushed hard to get a price cap in place that would allow the Europeans to buy roughly at the same discount and avoid sanctions from the Russians as the Indians and the Chinese are now buying. Now, this was a contentious debate inside the EU because the Polish government was trying to drive the price cap levels to $30, which is half of where it eventually landed. That was Poland. That wasn't the United States. The US was saying, no, that's too low. That's going to cause massive disjunction in the market. Now, no one was talking about that. Everyone was saying the Americans are trying to cut them off. No, the Americans were actually behind the scenes trying to punish the Russians while keeping the markets actually working, avoiding worse supply disruption for the Europeans that are already facing really serious challenges. But there's a massive difference between the view of the Polish government, the Finnish government, the Baltic governments on what should be done in Ukraine, and between, let's say, the French, the Italians, and the Germans. Look, the fact is, Adi, that 27 European governments have voted unanimously now for 9 rounds of Russian sanctions. And they've also voted unanimously to invite Ukraine and Moldova into the EU. And on that latter issue, the Americans have not had a dog in that fight. So, the fact is that the Europeans collectively have embraced Ukraine as a European war and therefore an object of European collective defense in a way that NATO has not. So I do believe that, yes, the Europeans are taking on significant economic hardship, which the Americans have always said, oh, the Europeans don't want to pay for defense. The Americans are paying for their defense. Not only are the Europeans now paying more for defense, but they're also taking it in the teeth in terms of the economic consequences of decoupling from Russia. But the Europeans are, I think, much more consistently accepting the fact that this is a European war. And if anyone, there's a reasonable discussion that we could have about who is more likely to break first in terms of the level of unity in supporting Ukraine and in punishing Russia, the Americans or the Europeans. And I think you could make strong arguments on both sides there, but certainly not in the near term, not in the next 12 or 24 months. I don't see it.
Okay, I want to make sure that we talk about the economy as well, and I'm going to go to an audience question. So this is from Bettina, who's in Florida, and it's a big general question. So Ian, you can take it first. And the question is, what is the economic mood in Davos? Do leaders appear worried, or do they appear confident?
CEOs are confident. They like their balance sheets. They like their recent orders. I think they feel a little better than I have seen recently. I was just talking to Larry Summers about that a few moments ago, and he's meeting with a lot more CEOs than I have been in the last 24 hours, and he certainly feels that way. I've been talking to a lot of folks on the government side over the last couple of days. I would say that they are less constructive. They are more concerned about fragmentation, which is the theme of the World Economic Forum this year. They're more concerned about the direct geopolitical challenges. They're also more concerned about the growing gap that we see between the advanced industrial economies and the developing world. and the fact that that is likely to get much worse, not better. So I think it's a mixed mood. I definitely think that no one is feeling very strongly confident. If folks are confident, they are confident without a great deal of conviction. I also think that there is generally much more confidence about the US, both in terms of its political resilience after midterms, as well as the economic position that it's presently in compared to the Europeans. And that's always weird when you're in Europe, because, I mean, look, the high-level government officials are much more from Europe, but the attendees overall, private sector and NGOs and pundits, are much more from the United States. So there is a push and pull on that.
Yeah, I mean, so some of the stuff that I was picking up as well, I mean, so we're talking about, are we going to face recession or not? I mean, there are parts of the world that are booming, and, you know, India is probably top of the list. So there's no talk about recession there. Even China, which, you know, during a sort of a period that was characterized by a lot of COVID lockdown, you know, grew 3% according to official figures. And as you say, is poised to grow more rapidly now. Yeah. So, you know, it's a mixed picture. And I think you're right. I would not call this gloom and doom that we are necessarily headed toward, you know, a deep recession. On the other hand, we're continuing to see layoffs. You know, Microsoft just announced a bunch, especially in the tech sector and in the financial sector, but not just limited to those. So it's, you know, we're not out of the clouds yet. So we mentioned, Ian, that you guys had put out a report on top political risks out there. You know, can you talk about one or two others that you think would be interesting and relevant for our audience?
Well, I mean, a couple I would put out there would be, first of all, the fact that human development for the last, you know, for 50 years on pretty much every indicator had been improving dramatically all over the world. The last three, they've gotten worse. You've lost 5 years of global human development growth since the pandemic hit, then with the Russian war, and on top of that, growing impact of climate change. In 2023, we fully expect to be worse on those indicators. That's a real problem because it erodes the global middle class. I mean, the big story of globalization for the last 50 years wasn't that 0.1% got rich at Davos. It was that we created a global middle class. Now, if you erode that, what you're doing is increasing populist demands, very understandable demands, on leaders all over the world to move away from free trade, move towards more nationalist and protectionist policies, or else they'll be voted out. And I think there are a lot of countries around the world that are deeply vulnerable to that. I think across Latin America, Egypt, I would certainly put in that basket. Turkey, I would put in that basket. Maybe less so Southeast Asia, certainly not India, but that's a very serious concern I have. And, you know, so many of the challenges that are being addressed at this week's forum are global challenges, but the responses are only national challenges. I mean, what could be more global than climate? We all understand that we're at 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. We all understand the impact is happening globally. It's getting worse. And yet the responses aren't at all global. They're local responses. And that means that the countries that are hit the hardest are going to get angrier and angrier. And so the fact that we're talking about a fragmented world is in some ways an admission that while globalization has created an enormous amount of wealth, globalism, the political ideology that globalization will work for everyone, and without intervention, without structural intervention in how capitalism works, and how governments govern, how they intervene, how they redistribute wealth, have fundamentally failed billions of people on the planet. I don't see, I mean, that's a tectonic risk. It's a super tanker that is, you know, kind of coming at us over many years, but we're starting to feel it in a much more direct way. It's grippy in 2023.
So here's a question from Ugochukwu from Nigeria, and he or she is noting that some African countries will be undergoing elections, you know, coming into the election season, or
in Nigeria shortly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so the question is, you know, do you see how will that affect, you know, whether it's stability, trade, you know, how are you looking at, you know, political season, the election season in Nigeria and elsewhere on the.
I mean, the problem is, I mean, you know, I'll tell you what's really sad is that I've been here for over 2 days. I've probably had 40 bilats. This is the first public question I've gotten about Africa. I've met a bunch of people that are here from Nigeria, from South Africa. The rest, South Africa has a great delegation here, and the rest. But when you talk about global macro, Africa is so far down the list. It's such a small percentage of global GDP. It's not what the CEOs are investing in. It's not what they're spending time thinking about. They've virtually never traveled there. It's a huge problem. I mean, when we talk about Africa, it's almost always macro in terms of something that's blown up, not in terms of something we should be investing in. And yet, you're talking about extraordinary human capital that is increasingly online and productive and developing entrepreneurial models. It's just too small. I mean, I was in Ethiopia just before the pandemic, had a fantastic trip down there. Over 100 million Africans that are, almost completely underserved by technology. That country is poised to explode in terms of growth, even though they've also had a lot of problems in terms of civil strife. But the investments on the ground in new technologies are literally at the $100,000 to $1 million level. You just can't get people at the WEF that are serious interested at those levels. Now, okay, Ethiopia is, kind of an extreme model because it is, still so off the grid in terms of agriculture and education and healthcare. But what an opportunity, 100 million people. I mean, there should be people out there, young entrepreneurs that are saying, I want in. And they're just not. And look, Nigeria is much more exciting as the largest economy in Africa, but frankly, still compared to, this is the year that India is finally getting everyone's attention.
Yeah.
India is finally attracting the top technology companies in the world to start saying, hey, they've got real growth. It's a real population. It's a real economy. They've got a strong, stable leader who's investing in getting this place efficient and wired. And we want in. But I'm not seeing any of that yet from those people in Africa. That's the sad answer to that question.
Yeah, that is a problem. Thanks for that answer. So I think you're here for a couple more days. What are you looking forward to in the next couple of days?
Well, tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk to the entire Japanese delegation. My friend Tak Ninami, who runs the Keizai Doyukai, which is their big industry group, and also the CEO of Suntory, put it together. And we've got a bunch of cabinet officials, like the foreign minister, many minister, and then we have all these CEOs. And we're going to have a breakfast where we're just really crunching into what all of this means, the changes in the global economy and politics for Japan, the world's third largest economy. I mean, other than going to Tokyo, there is nowhere else you could do that. And I will learn immensely from that engagement. I'm enormously, I think we're starting at 7:30, which is, really tough. It means I'm not partying tonight. Oh, well, that's so well. It's going to be fascinating. I just, that as someone whose life is about, sort of both content and also trying to develop relationships with people who really do move the needle on how the world is developing. It's unique in that regard, and it's exhausting and it's intellectually challenging, but it's also pretty exciting. And so that kind of thing is why I come here.
Well, Sting and Idris Elba and I will miss you tonight. So I hope it goes well tomorrow.
That's an exciting party, right? I mean, I'd love to go any other time, but I can't do it.
All right. So Ian, thank you for joining us. It was really great to have you on this show of all shows. So Ian Bremmer, thanks for being on the New World of Work.
Great seeing you, man.
All right, so that was Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group, and I hope that was a useful accounting of some of the big geopolitical risks that are out there. All right, so before I close, I want to we'll hear from our friends at Unisys one more time. Where some see barriers, Unisys sees breakthroughs. Unisys pushes what's possible across digital workplaces, app modernization, cloud, and beyond. Unisys keep breaking through. So please be sure to join us next week. We'll be back at headquarters. My guest will be Tiger Rajan, who is the president and CEO of Genpact, which is a global professional services firm that provides clients with advice on digital transformation. We'll be talking about the new world of work and how to win the war on talent. So until then, thank you for joining us. I'm Adi Ignatius. This is the New World of Work.